Fantasy Baseball Cafe podcast. I am your host, Josh Shepardson. You can follow me on Twitter at BChad50, and I'm back today to talk third baseman. The hot corner is a position that has some top-heavy feel to the rankings. There's some elite talent at the top, which will go in the very early rounds, but thins out a little bit as you get down the rankings. Some of the middle tier guys do have some breakout potential, but we'll get into that a little bit here. And before I get started, though, I'd like to direct your attention to FantasyBaseballCafe.com, where we've got some great content up right now. We continue to crank out the fantasy team preview power rankings. We've got my rankings. We've got Dolla's rankings on there, position by position, and the top 250. So if you want to check those out while you watch the podcast, or if you want to check those out after the fact, they're there for your viewing pleasure. Also, hop on the Fantasy Baseball Cafe forums, where you're going to find some very active fantasy baseball enthusiasts like myself, like yourself. It's really a great environment for fantasy baseball folks. But without further ado, let's get on to the third base rankings. They're kicked off at the top by Miguel Cabrera. Miguel Cabrera is a top 5 pick, essentially, and he's a stud. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. Last year, he had a down year and hit 25 homers with a 333 average. He had 44 homers in 2012 and 2013. Basically, he's a great anchor for teams. He had ankle and foot surgery in the offseason, but projects to be ready on or very close to opening day. And he's the type of player that you want to select in those top 5 picks to anchor the position, really fill. Third base also has first base eligibility, which doesn't hurt, but he's going to carry more value at third base on sites where he is eligible there. Second is Anthony Rendon. Got some positive news since the last podcast in which we discussed him, which was the second base rankings. His MCL is showing improvement as of an MRI on Monday, so it's looking iffy as if he'll be ready for opening day, but he should be ready fairly early. I do worry that the knee injury might sap some of the stolen bases. He did steal 17 last year. Probably knock a few off of those just for safety and precautionary reasons. Don't want to peg too high on the projection and end up coming up short. Better to project a little bit low and come up a little bit higher. He did hit 21 home runs as well last year, and the rest of his well-rounded skill set still makes him a very high pick. I probably bump him down into the later second round instead of the early second round, late first round as a result of this injury, though. So move him down just a little bit, but he's still a top 3 round pick in my eyes. Adrian third. He hit 19 home runs last year, which was a down year by his standards, after hitting 30 in 2013, 36 in 2012, and 32 in 2011. But his 19 home runs last year did come with a 324 average, so he's a great contact hitter. I do see him getting back over 20 home runs this year. Don't think he'll get back to 30, but we're talking about a very good hitter. Makes a lot of contact. You're going to get average. You're going to get homers. You're going to get run production stats, assuming you get some bounce backs here from Shin-Soo Choo and Prince Fielder. If you don't, the run production could come up a little bit light. I do think you're going to get a bounce back, hence the third ranking. I like Beltre. He's very bankable, very reliable. Fourth is Josh Donaldson. I did tussle with the idea of moving him ahead of Adrian Beltre. He moves from O.Co Coliseum in Oakland to the much more hitter-friendly Rogers Center, playing for the Blue Jays this year. Hit 29 home runs last year after hitting 24 and 13. His average did drop from 301 to 255, and that was really the result of his line drive rate nosediving. If you can hit a few more line drives, which is a volatile batted ball type, I do expect the batting average to go up a bit. I don't think he's a true 300 hitter, but something like a 270 average would be plenty good, since I do think he's going to eclipse 30 home runs this year. Gonna put up some big run production numbers. If he's hitting second in front of Edwin Encarnacion and Jose Bautista, expect over 100 runs scored. If he's hitting behind him, expect over 100 runs batted in. And wherever he's hitting, he's going to put up those plentiful run production stats. Fifth is Evan Longoria. Longoria played in 162 games last year after playing in just 160 and 13. Just my goodness, I misspoke there. I apologize. So he's missed 2 games in 2 years. He's healthy. He stays healthy. Biggest problem with him last year was that his power dropped, but he's just 29 years old. I do expect some rebound in the power categories, namely home runs. The lineup looks a little bit different, but he's going to be hitting in the heart of it, so he's going to get ample run production opportunities. I like Evan Longoria. He looks like a top 5, 3-bagger to me. Checking in just behind him is Todd Frazier. Frazier exploded for 29 home runs and also surprisingly stole 20 bases last year. He wasn't an efficient base stealer. I do expect stolen base regression this year. I'm thinking in the 10 to 14 stolen base range and an average around 260. So a little bit of a drop in batting average. He might produce some solid run production numbers if we get a bounce back from Jay Bruce this year, and if we see a bounce back from Joe, and if Joey Votto stays healthy. There's definitely room for improvement in the run production categories. That's why Frazier checks in at 6th. 7th is Kyle Seager. Kyle Seager has a notable platoon split. He does hit right-handed pitching better than left-handed pitching, but you know what? He's still a top 10 third base option, third straight year of 20 or more homers. He hit 25 last year, stole 7 bases. He's a 260s hitter, which is plenty with the stolen base and home run contributions. And he's going to hit in a good spot to drive in runs. Probably going to hit, I would guess, 5th behind the combination of Robinson Cano and Nelson Cruz. Might see him make a run at 100 runs batted in this year, batting behind that duo. So I like Seager this year. If you're not willing to pay top dollar at the position, Seager's a pretty good target. He's going to come cheaper than most of these guys. I'd guess he and Frazier are going to go in the same ADP area. 8th is David Wright. I do think he bounces back this year. He only had 8 home runs and 8 stolen bases last year, but he played hurt most of the year. 18 and 17 in 13. K percentage went up last year, which hurt the batting average, brought it down to 269, but he's over 300 in 12 and 13. I'm thinking he gets back into double digits in homers and stolen bases, maybe 15-15 with an average that gets closer to the 300 marks of 12 and 13. I think a fully healthy David Wright is capable of a solid bounce back. He's a little bit older, so maybe we lop some points off and call it a 290 average instead of 300, but 290 with 15 homers, 15 stolen bases, a dozen and a dozen, whatever. Good counting stats from the 3-hole. That's a guy that really fills all 5 categories. Maybe doesn't wow you in any of them, save for possibly batting average, but that kind of across-the-board production really plays very well. 9 is Nolan Arenado. Nolan Arenado plays in a great ballpark in Colorado. Coors Field obviously is a hitter's paradise. Good lineup. Good chance for run production with the return of Carlos Gonzalez and Troy Tulowitzki. He had 18 home runs and 467 plate appearances last year with a 287 average. Makes a lot of contact, just a 12.4% K rate. But his infield fly ball rate is a bit high, which is probably a big part of the reason why his batting average is under 300, despite the fact that he has such a small K rate. I'd expect him to hit over 20 home runs this year. If he can cut down on the pop-ups, maybe we get an average around 300, but I'm going to say that he's probably in that 285 range again, 290. Around 20 homers. Doesn't have huge power, but he gets the most out of it with his home ballpark. And like I said, he should hit around 20. He's pacing to blow past that last year if he'd gotten a full season worth of at-bats. So I'm expecting more of the same. I don't necessarily think you're going to get a huge step forward. I think what you're seeing with Nolan Arenado is pretty darn close to what you're going to get, which is really good. But I think a lot of the people that have him ranked higher than I do are expecting a leap in talent. But based on the scouting reports I've read over the years, projects to be a good hitter, doesn't project to have huge over-the-fence power, should hit for a high average. And basically, what he did last year is what the scouting reports expected. So I think I won't call him a finished product, but I'd say he's pretty darn close to it. And that's okay. It's still very good. It's still a top 10 third baseman. Carlos Santana checks in 10th. He's a guy that I covered with the catchers and the first baseman already. Just to remind you folks, he hit 27 home runs last year with 5 stolen bases, 231 batting average, but he could probably add about 20 points to that fairly easily by basically doing the same thing as last year and just having a little bit more favorable BAPIP luck. Guy that gets a boost in OBP leagues, guy that gets a boost in leagues where he carries catcher, first base, and third base eligibility. I just drafted him in an auction last night. I was happy to have him. Provides me some insurance around the diamond, even though I'm probably going to use him at catcher almost exclusively. But having that kind of eligibility is great. If you hit on, say, a free agent edition at catcher, and you can move him over to third base, excellent. Or or if you have him slotted as your third baseman and your catcher gets hurt and you have to go rummaging through the waiver wire, gives you a little bit more flexibility. So keep that in mind when you're drafting. 11th is Pablo Sandoval. Takes his talents from the West Coast to the East Coast, moving from the Giants to the Red Sox. We've seen a little bit of an off-field scuffle with him saying that he had no intentions of going back to the Giants. From a fantasy perspective, none of this matters. It's kind of entertaining to me as a Giants fan, but last year he hit 16 home runs with a 278 average I'm sorry, 16 home runs with a 278 average in 13 and 279 average last year. So basically, you can pencil him in for about a 278, 279 average. I'd expect something like the 16 home runs again. He moves from a ballpark that suppressed home runs to another one that does. The beauty of Fenway suppressing home runs is part of that's to do with the big green monster, which he's going to pepper and hit some doubles off of. So I'd actually say, I said probably 278, 279 average. Bump that up probably 8 to 10 points because he's going to get a few extra hits just by spraying some doubles off that wall. So I do like Pablo Sandoval this year. Don't expect him to approach 20 home runs. I still see him falling short of that just because the ballpark isn't really going to help him as much as some might perceive it to. As a switch hitter, most of his at-bats are going to be taken as a left-handed batter. So you might see some boost, but I wouldn't go crazy. 20 home runs is the maximum, I think, but I'm pegging him for more of the upper teens again. Ryan Zimmerman checks in 12. He only played in 61 games last year, but in his 240 plate appearances, he did hit 5 home runs, did hit for 280 average. In 13, we can see what he did with a full season of playing time. 633 plate appearances, 26 homers, and a 275 average. He's not playing first base. That should hopefully help keep him healthy. And I can see him approaching his 13 numbers again. You do have to factor in the fact that he has battled injuries a bit. So even if you think that he can approach that, which I do, I've docked him a couple places. If he weren't the injury risk, I'd probably move him up ahead of Nolan Arenado, maybe ahead of David Wright. Right in that Kyle Seager range. The lack of stolen bases compared to Seager would probably put him just behind him, but that's where you're looking at. If you're willing to take a chance on his health a little more than I am, move him up inside the top 10. Chris Davis checks in at 13. He had 26 home runs and 525 plate appearances, but it came with an ugly 196 average. And he's a guy that was killed by the shift. I do expect him to hit for more average, but a repeat of 2013 is not something that gamers should be banking on. I think over 30 home runs, but I think that average is going to remain poor, probably in the 220, 230 range. Strikes out a lot, and unless he's going to be able to beat that shift, it's going to be very hard for him to improve on what might look like to some a very unlucky BAPIP, but I don't think it's terribly unlucky. A little bit. He still had a high line drive rate, low infield fly ball rate, but when you got fielders positioned to where you're going to hit the ball, you can hit the ball as hard as you want to. If it finds a glove, it doesn't matter. Chris Bryant checks in 14th. This could prove to be way too low or way too high. We're talking about a young player with a big strikeout rate, but monster power. He had 43 home runs behind at the AA and AAA level combined last year. Also stole 15 bases, but like I said, struck out a lot. 162 Ks last year. He's going to be a batting average liability, possibly, but he hits for big power, and that's what you're drafting. He should be up fairly early. I do expect the Cubs to send him down to manipulate his service time and get the extra year of having him on the roster and not getting him to free agency quite as quickly. But he's a guy that could honestly hit 30 home runs this season, but might do it with a low batting average due to that high strikeout rate. With young players, it's best to, in yearly leagues, maybe not take that chance that others are willing to, just because there are so many pitfalls for young players making that transition. You're really banking on a quick learning curve, and Bryant has the skills to do that. So if he falls into a fair range in drafts, go ahead and grab him. He certainly has upside to surpass some of the guys in front of him, but I think people fall in love with the upside of first-year players like that. I own Bryant in a league. I'm happy with what I got him for, but the deeper the league, I'd say the less inclined I am to take the chance because the replacement level is just so low if you whiff. The shallower the league, be more willing to be aggressive and take a chance on a guy like Bryant. 15 is Matt Carpenter. He's a line drive hitting machine. He hit 272 last year, but he looks like a guy who could approach closer to that 300 average again, like he has hit in years past. Hit 8 home runs, but could hit 10 plus again this year. Won't steal bases, but will score a ton of runs, hitting atop the Cardinals' order. Great on base percentage, great walk rate, makes a lot of contact. So if you're looking for average, you're looking for runs, Matt Carpenter's a good guy. He'll chip in a few home runs, but he's not going to steal any bases. But overall, he's a guy that falls out of the top 12, so you could say he's a fringe starter at the hot corner in standard leagues, but some of the guys in front of him, like Carlos Santana, are probably best suited playing someplace else on the diamond. Got a couple guys that might be used in at first base or outfield in the case of Ryan Zimmerman. So I'd say he's pretty close to a starter in standard leagues. 17 is Yasmani Tomas, and he's a guy that is going to fall in my rankings a bit. When I made these at the time, we really had a very limited. I had a very limited bit of data to work with. Scouting reports are great in terms of his power, raw power. Problem is I'm starting to read some Diane Viciato comps. Bad body, struggles with third base, which really doesn't matter a ton to his fantasy value. He comes into the season with third base eligibility in different fantasy providers, so it's not going to hurt him from that aspect. But if he slipped into the outfield, there are some talented outfielders in Arizona, and he's probably not going to be an asset defensively out there. So he could be a guy like Mark Trumbo, who gets lifted for a defensive replacement late. Sorry, okay, I had my tongue. But the power looks real. That's what you're banking on if you are drafting him. The problem is the plate discipline leaves something to be desired. The spring, it's a small sample. He's making not only the transition to facing major league pitching, but the transition to living in a new country. So I'm going to cut him a little bit of slack. He's still probably going to check in my top 25, but he is going to definitely drop the next time I update my rankings. 18th is Aaron Hill. I discussed him on the second base podcast, so I'm not really going to go in depth here beyond saying that I do expect to bounce back from him. The ranking looks a little bit funny because he carries more value at second base. I would probably take him behind a couple of the third basemen behind him, but the way that the FantasyPros rankings happen to align, he does rank a little bit higher on here. And like I said, you're drafting him to play second base, so we'll move on. Next up is Manny Machado, who ranks 19th. Machado hit 12 home runs with a 278 average and 354 plate appearances last year. He could hit over 20 home runs this year. I mean, he was pacing to get pretty darn close to that last year. He's a young player with extreme talent that could actually blow up. And if I'm drafting and I already have a second or a third baseman, or I'm looking to really hit a home run with my pick, I'm going to take Machado in front of a number of guys in front of him. And I would take him probably in front of Aaron Hill, who ranks 18th, Yasmani Tomas, who ranks 17th, Daniel Murphy, 16th. I'd actually take him in front of Matt Carpenter if I'm looking to really swing for the fences here. I would still take Bryant in front of him because I believe Bryant's immediate upside is superior to Machado's. But Machado's got legitimate top 10 upside for the position. He is a very bright prospect, or was a very bright prospect, and now is a very talented young player. Eventually, I do believe the light's going to go on. He's still young, so it may still be a couple seasons before he really truly explodes. But I'm buying into Manny Machado, but I think ultimately he's going to come up just short this year. I think he's going to be a fine play as a corner infielder or as that dice roll second, third baseman on your team. 20th is another high upside player, Xander Bogaerts. Touched on him in depth on the Shortstop podcast, but let's just say he's got big upside. He's young. He's another guy that could hit over 20 home runs with some slight adjustments, maybe a batting average uptick this year as well. 21st is Chase Headley. He hit 13 home runs, stole 7 bases, and 531 plate appearances last year. With a 243 average. I'd say all of those numbers will go up ever so slightly. He's in a better ballpark now for the full season playing at Yankee Stadium. So something like 17 to 18 home runs seems reasonable, maybe making a run at 20. If he's able to stay healthy and get over 600 plate appearances, probably approach double digits in steals again, maybe get 10 there. A little bit more batting average luck, a few more fly balls leaving the yard. That batting average suddenly looks like it's a 255 to 260 average. So he's a guy whose value's on the rise, but he's also a guy that's dealt with some injuries. So you got to dock him a little bit. And I think if you're more willing to roll the dice on him staying healthy, you move him up a few spots, but ultimately this feels like a fair ranking for Chase Headley. Aramis Ramirez is 22nd. 531 plate appearances last year. He had 15 home runs with a 285 average. Probably not a 20 home run threat anymore. Uh, I think what we saw last year is about what you're going to get. This is expected to be Aramis Ramirez's swan song, his final season. And you know what? He's a reliable option with a decent average. And 15 to 18 home runs is nothing to sneeze at. Should get good run production numbers in a talented Brewers lineup. Solid, unspectacular. Upside, I would say, is limited. 23rd is Josh Harrison. As I mentioned in the second base podcast, not a guy that I'm going to be targeting this year. He's a guy whose value is derived from across the board production. So when you're a guy like that and someone like myself expects regression across the board, your value is going to tumble, and that's the case with Josh Harrison here. Nick Castellanos ranks 24th behind him. He's a guy that I actually like a little bit more than Harrison. If I'm drafting for the upside. Line drive stroke could hit over 280. He's going to hit lower in the order than some of the guys in front of him, which is going to hurt his RBI and run totals a bit. But he's in a talented, lengthy Tigers lineup, so he's probably going to offer more run production RBIs than you would expect from a guy that hits that low in the order. I'm expecting mid-teen home run totals this year. Hit 11 last year. I think he can add a couple more on, but so we're talking about a guy that could hit 280 with maybe 15 home runs and passable run production stats. Pretty good if you're looking for a corner infielder, or if you're in a really deep league, third baseman, if we're talking like 14, 16 team league, not the worst option there. And a guy with some upside. Martin Prado, a guy that doesn't really have upside. He is what he is. He checks in 25th. As I said when discussing with the second baseman, don't expect him to approach double-digit home runs again. Bad ballpark for that in Miami, but should hit over 280. 285, 290 is probably a fair expectation. Not a guy who runs. Should hit in a decent spot to score some runs, maybe drive some in Miami. So decent option, more of a glue guy you can move around the diamond, good position flexibility, guy that I like to round out benches or possibly use as a middle infield option. Pedro Alvarez is 26th, and the book's out on Pedro Alvarez. We know what he is. Big power, just 18 home runs last year, but 36 and 13 and 30 in 2012. And when it's going right, he's going to hit the ball a long way. Problem is with big power comes a big strikeout rate with Pedro Alvarez, and that undermines his batting average. He's a guy that's going to be in a platoon this year with Corey Hart at first base, which is fine because he really doesn't hit left-handed pitching anyway. So Pedro Alvarez, if you're power-starved late in drafts, makes for a decent target. 27th is Mike Moustakas. 15 home runs and 500 plate appearances last year. Was demoted to AAA at one point in time. Was a very bright prospect coming up. Hasn't really figured it out, but if you want an example of a Royals third base prospect that took a little while to figure it out, look in left field. Alex Gordon is the poster child for that organization. Moustakas hit 5 home runs and 55 postseason plate appearances. It's dangerous to fall in love with small sample sizes like that, but it does point to the fact that he does have a well above average power, and I think he's a guy that could hit 20 home runs. Good contact rate should keep his batting average from being dreadful, but he doesn't make great contact, so we're still talking about a guy that's probably more of a 260s hitter, 250s hitter than a guy who makes a lot of contact and is going to even make a run at like 280. That's a little bit out of Moustakas' reach at this point, but I think a lot of people would take in their corner infield spot 20 home runs and 255, 260 average. Not the worst, certainly. Brett Lawrie checks in 28th. He is a change of scenery candidate. He moves from Toronto to Oakland. Kicked in the door when he was a prospect with in his first taste of the big leagues with the Blue Jays, but just hasn't replicated that since. Bad ballpark. I'm not going to be investing in Lawrie. Maybe the coaching staff is able to coax more out of him in Oakland than the one in Toronto, but I just hate the ballpark change, and I hate the lineup change. I mean, the Blue Jays lineup is super loaded. Their ballpark was great, and Lawrie just wasn't able to do it there. He is still young enough to figure it out. I'm just not going to be the one that invests to find out if that's the case. Lonnie Chisenhall checks in 29th. He's a guy that you don't want to use against left-handed pitching. He did make some improvements last year, which helped his overall line. He had 13 home runs with a 280 average. Could pop a few more home runs, but I do expect his average to dip probably into the 270s this year. Good line drive rate, decent placeholder, decent injury replacement, decent utility guy if you're in a deeper league that uses corner infield utility, first base, third base. You gotta grab someone from somewhere, and Chisenhall from third base isn't a bad option. Alex Rodriguez, I'm sorry, Alex Rodriguez checks in at 30th, and he's basically a mystery at this point. We don't know what to expect from him. I wouldn't draft him with high grand expectations, but he could exceed this ranking. You got to love the ballpark that he plays in for maximizing whatever home run power he has left in his bat. But he's older. He missed an entire year of baseball. It's tough to really rely on him, but you got to put him somewhere. I think he has some more upside than some of the guys behind him. So at this point, 30th feels fair for Alex Rodriguez. He should be the primary designated hitter for the Yankees. He was expected to take some fielding practice at first base in the spring and get ready to play there, but it looks like he's more or less going to be spelling Chase Headley at third base and playing designated hitter. So playing as a designated hitter. So there is some downside here, but at 30th, I think the upside slightly outweighs the downside. And if you whiff with Rodriguez, you're not going to be killed by taking him as the 30th ranked third baseman. Trevor Plouffe is 31st, 14 home runs in each of the last 2 years. He's about a 255, 260 hitter. I mean, that's what you can expect going forward. Biggest knock on Plouffe is that he will eventually have some competition for the hot corner. Miguel Sano, if he tears the cover off the ball, will be a guy that you could see this summer, rendering Trevor Plouffe useless at that point. 32nd is Maikel Franco. He's a guy that hit very well in Dominican Winter League, I believe it was, or Venezuelan Winter League. I don't remember off the top of my head, but has struggled in the spring. Makes contact at a decent rate, has above average power. Hit 16 home runs with a 257 average in AAA. Which was a down year by his standards. He did get hotter as the season wore on. I could actually see him producing that type of line at the big league level, since he probably is more talented than that and should have done better than that at the AAA level. Expecting that to be the case early this season, a late season promotion, that kind of, or mid-season, I'm thinking more along the lines of with Franco. I think he's a guy that you're going to see probably in June, maybe July. Franco will get some time at third base. Cody Ashley's not going to prevent him from playing. He's a stopgap at this point. And if Franco's glove is bad enough, a move across the diamond to first base is possible. Ryan Howard is on the very downside of his career. Ruben Amaro Jr., the general manager of the Phillies, has basically stated that the club's better without him. So that kind of goes to show what kind of faith Ruben has in Ryan Howard. So the opportunity is going to be there for Franco. I don't love him, but if you're looking for some upside, this is a good place to dip in. Chris Johnson's 33rd. He could be a decent RBI source. It looks like he's going to be miscast as a cleanup hitter behind Freddie Freeman. So he's going to be hitting behind a very high on-base percentage hitter in Freeman. But he's not, but Johnson himself isn't a very good hitter. You're looking at maybe a dozen dingers. His strikeout rate blew up to 26% last year. If he's not able to curb that, the average is probably only going to play in the 260s. So not a great source of statistical value, but a guy who might get you those extra RBI if you're in need of them. The lineup spot dictates that could be the case, but just don't expect a lot in power, stolen bases, or batting average. Basically, you're chasing a lineup-dependent stat if you're drafting Chris Johnson, and you're taking advantage of the fact that he's going to get playing time, and that's going to be a common thread between a lot of these guys towards the back of the list. Like number 34 ranked third baseman Casey McGehee. He's playing third base for the Giants. He's going to play basically every day. He doesn't have much power. He doesn't have much speed. We're talking about maybe 6 home runs, 6 stolen bases. Average is probably going to drop into the 260, 270 range, but he gets on base at a decent clip. He could hit in a favorable spot in the lineup to score a few runs, drive a few in. Basically, these are your deep league options where playing time is paramount, and Casey McGehee at least checks that box. 35th is Luis Valbuena. He moves from the Cubs to the Astros this year. He should see the bulk of the playing time at third. He should not be playing against left-handed pitching, so he'll probably take a seat against them. Last year, he had 16 home runs with a .249 batting average and 547 plate appearances. That's basically the ceiling for Luis Valbuena. Maybe he can hit a couple more home runs, but I wouldn't project it. I'd say anywhere from 14 to 18 is probably a reasonable expectation. The average could drop a little bit, but the 240's average feels about right. So if you're looking for a little bit of help in those categories, or you're in a deep league, Valbuena fits the bill. David Freese is he's basically fallen off the map the last 2 years. 260 average last year, 262 and 13. I don't see him getting back to his Cardinals heyday batting averages around 300. We're probably talking about a 260 hitter now. It's only we're talking about a dozen home run ceiling. He's hit under 10 in each of the last 2 seasons. Basically, Freese has aged poorly. He really hits left-handed pitching, so if you're playing daily games, Freese is a guy that you'll want to consider against southpaws, but not a player that you're going to want to use against righties. And his struggles against righties the last couple of years really hurt his overall value in season-long games. 37th is Connor Gillespie, another guy who doesn't hit left-handed pitching well, like Luis Valbuena, a couple spots ahead of him. 282 average last year, 7 homers and 0 stolen bases and 506 plate appearances. Did have a high BAPIP. I'd expect the batting average to go down. If we're talking about a 270 hitter with middling power and no stolen base contributions, you're talking about basically a guy that's going to be on the waiver wire in standard leagues most of the season, but a guy who, based on playing time, could have value in deeper mixed leagues and AL-only formats. 38th is Juan Uribe. 404 plate appearances last year, 9 homers, 311 batting average. That batting average is probably going to drop around 50 points. And he's a guy who I do not expect to keep the third base job all season. Corey Seager, younger brother of Kyle Seager, is a shortstop prospect. But with the Dodgers acquiring Jimmy Rollins in the offseason, he's blocked at this point, and Seager's a bigger guy, a guy that a lot of people, prospect evaluators, expect to eventually move off shortstop anyway. The tea leaves basically tell you what's going to happen here, or should happen this year. Seager hits the ball at a high level in AAA, gets a promotion, ends up playing third base, and never looks back. I mean, this feels like Manny Machado 2.0, basically. Guy that really rakes, gets to the big leagues, and moves off a shortstop and is a well above average defender at third base. And I see that being the case for Seager this year. So Uribe's days are numbered in my eyes. Marcus Semien is 39th. Discussed him with the second baseman. So we'll just wrap this up with the rankings by looking at Joey Gallo. Hit 42 home runs in high A and double A last year. Low batting average at double A because hitters were actually able to exploit his high strikeout rate. Was really too much for high A pitchers. Gonna probably open the year repeating double A to start, possibly at the AAA level. He's a guy with massive raw power. He could get to the big leagues sometime this summer. In fact, I would expect him to, but it's also possible that his strikeout rate could leave him struggling a little bit with some of the upper minor league pitchers. But there's not a lot blocking Joey Gallo. He is a third baseman, but he's not going to probably play there when he breaks into the big leagues because of the presence of Adrian Beltre. But first base, designated hitter are very much up for grabs, and I could see Joey Gallo getting a taste of big league action at those positions this year. So when he does get called up, if you're in need of power, Joey Gallo is a guy that you're going to want to consider investing in. We're going to close the show like we usually do, and that's with me identifying and addressing a couple players that I have ranked notably higher and lower than my peers at FantasyPros. There are a couple guys that I actually discussed in depth in the podcast. Yasmani Tomas have ranked 17th. Expert consensus rank is 23rd. Well, I pretty much showed my cards on this one. That sizable gap is going to close. I imagine that I'm going to move Tomas down into the 23rd area where my peers are. So if you're drafting him for power, but recognize that there's some plate discipline issues here, and I'm not as high as I was on him when he was a mystery. Now that we have a little bit more to work with, he's going to be moving down my rankings. Manny Machado, I have ranked 19th. Expert consensus rank is 13th. I think the expert consensus rank is a good representation of Machado's ceiling as opposed to his likely output this year. As I said, I could see myself moving Machado up a few places, but I can't see myself putting him in front of Chris Bryant. I think maybe 15th is about as high as I would go with Machado. 13th just is a little bit too rich for my blood. So that's going to do it. Thank you for tuning in and listening to me go through the third base ranks. We're going to be moving on here in the next few days and continuing to break down the rankings. We got the outfielders left, starting pitchers, and relievers. So I hope you're ready, because I'm ready to break them down for you. Thanks for viewing, and take care.